All right, hello everyone. It's so good to see so many old faces and some new names we haven't seen here before. Welcome. This is a Build Up webinar. If you haven't attended a Build Up webinar before, this is a space where we get together roughly monthly to host conversations with people doing interesting thinking and projects around digital peace building, doing those in interesting ways. Today, we are talking about a project that we're working on, digital media arts for an inclusive public sphere, also known as digital maps. You'll hear us refer to that through the rest of the presentation. It's a program that we have been running in collaboration with Build Up, with ourselves, Build Up, with the British Council, Sheffield University, Manchester University, the American University of Kurdistan, and Data Value People. And in addition to 18/19 teams of young leaders from creative arts and media organizations across 8 different countries. They have been in this 6-month process conducting social media mapping in order to understand how issues of identity, social cohesion, and inclusion manifest on and are shaped by social media. So if you'll just give me a second, I can share my screen and say more about that. And then as you'll see, we'll have Elena here today who will be presenting some of the process of participatory action research that people went through and some of the findings. So give me just a second to share my screen. Hello, it's great to see everyone here. Okay. Great, we can get started. So as I was saying, the Digital Maps program used participatory action research, a process for these teams and organizations to design pilot interventions that counter polarization and promote inclusivity and openness in the networked public sphere. And again, that was in these 8 different countries in Middle East and North Africa. This webinar will outline what that process was, how participatory action research was used, and some of the resulting social media analysis, or some of the things that were identified through that social media analysis in terms of signals and polarization and ways to respond to it. And we'll also talk about, as we always do in the spirit of learning and openness, talk about the challenges that we've had and the lessons learned in doing this type of practitioner-led social media analysis and design process. Feel free to engage in the chat as the presentation is ongoing. You can also input questions in the Q&A. And I wonder, Elena, if before you start, you could just take a second to introduce yourself if anyone's unfamiliar.
Hi, everybody. My name is Elena. I'm sitting in London, and I'm the strategy lead at Build Up, and I've been pretty involved in the Digital Maps program. I'm really excited to be here to share some of what's been coming out of it.
Great. I think we're ready for you to go ahead.
I think, Julie has already provided much of the framing of the digital media arts for an inclusive public sphere program, but I just wanted to share this overall framing around the program. The DMAPS program, we think, is unique in the fact that it's premised on a recognition that effective polarization is something that is happening to users of social media, that it's built into the very logic of the social media platforms, and is probably exacerbating existing fault lines in societies. And this means that the emerging norms of digital culture and their effect on interest, attitudes, affiliations, and interactions of social media users present a risk to the type of inclusive public sphere required to build strong, open, and democratic cultures. As a cultural relations organization, this is really important for the British Council to explore as an area of work. As a digital peace building organization, it's something that's of great interest to us at Build Up as well. And our partners have also commented from other aspects, whether it's from data science, in the case of Data Value People, or community peace building in the case of the University of Sheffield. So we've all been approaching this kind of general concern. And I just wanted to acknowledge that in order to share the thinking that has informed this program, we've actually produced 2 papers, 2 position papers The first one was presented at a webinar yesterday, hosted by the University of Sheffield, and it outlined the 4 areas of theoretical research that support the program and how these translate into a research and design journey for participants. So if you missed that, there will be a recording of it, and the paper has been circulated. You can also ask us for it. This webinar is based on the second paper that we produced, which we'll be outlining now. And I think it's been circulated, Julie, to everyone who signed up?
Not yet, but it will be right after.
Okay, so it will be circulated right after the webinar. I wasn't sure if it was going before or after. So you'll actually receive essentially a write-up of what we're going to share in this webinar, as well as being able to watch the recording or share it if that's of interest. And the reason for doing this is that we think, beyond specifically what's happened in the program, that this approach might be of interest to others in the field, to others who want to engage in similar work, also potentially to academics working in this area. And I know there's some academic colleagues in the participant list. I won't call you out, so I will be really interested to hear whether this speaks to you as well. So can I have the next slide, Julie? Thanks. As Julie said, the Digital Maps program applies participatory action research to social media mapping in order to explore the details of polarizing dynamics that unfold on social media. And this participatory action research process comprises 4 participant-led steps. The first one is to define problem statements. And these problem statements are essentially around a research question, a thematic area, a set of research questions, a country or countries, and the social media platforms that will be explored. Then to collect data from some combination of Facebook, Twitter, or YouTube, and that was decided by the participants, to then code the data by topic, actor, and sentiment, and then finally to analyze it and design action based on that analysis. Now, I'm actually not going to spend a lot of time on this process, and the reason for it is that if you've been to Build Up webinars before, this is very similar to the process that we described when we talked about the generic Phoenix process. It's an application to that, to this particular situation. However, I do have slides for it. So if questions come up once I've finished, I'm happy to go back and go into detail into the process. I just thought that really going straight into some of the things that have come out of the participatory action research process might be more interesting to most of the people in the audience. So I'm going to jump straight to that, and we can come back to the process if you want. But I think the key thing to keep in mind is that what we were trying to do was to put in the hands of the 18 organizations that we were working with the capacity to define what kind of research they wanted to do, get the data they wanted, organize it, code it in the way they needed, in order that they could analyze it and design action based on that, on the analysis findings. And I'm going to show you some examples of that right now. Can I have the next slide? Okay, so if I just said that it's participatory action research and it's participant-led, then you might be asking, why are Julie and I presenting this and not the 18 organizations that have actually done the majority of this work? We've been in the background facilitating, accompanying, providing training, providing support, and providing the actual tool that has been used to conduct a lot of this analysis. But we haven't done most of this analysis ourselves. At times we've collaborated on it, but that's been about it. And the reason is that these 18 organizations are currently deep into implementing the interventions in social media that have come out of the analysis and are quite frankly pretty busy and too busy to engage in preparing a webinar. So we're doing this instead. But if some of you are interested in hearing directly from the organizations that have participated, we're holding an event in April, a virtual exchange event. Part of that event will be closed door and only for the participants to exchange their learnings. But some of it will actually will invite externals to come in and listen directly to the experience of the 18 partners in engaging in this kind of work. So if you're interested in that, email Julie about it, and she'll make sure to include you in our consideration for external invitees. But just to say that, because it seems a bit weird to say this is participant led and then Julie and I are talking about it. Okay, do you want to get to the next slide? So before I get into the specific findings that came out of that, I want to just explain that the main focus of conducting the social media mapping was to identify these signals of polarization that could then be addressed, right? Given the framing that we've given for the program. So where I'm not going to try and summarize all of the findings that all of the teams came up with, because that would take too long, what I'm going to try to do is provide an overview of the types of findings that participants arrived at in order to offer kind of an understanding of the opportunities of participatory action research as applied to social media mapping. And I think I wanted to start with this diagram because I said at the beginning that the digital maps approach recognizes that the attention for profit platform logic of social media leads to segregated networks and spreadable spectacle with emotive content that is rewarded by algorithms and therefore more likely to become viral. And so to kind of concretize this into an approach to analysis, to break that down into what are we looking for, we introduced participants to this framework, which I think actually came from your brain originally, Julie, after many iterations of work at Build Up. And the framework is a framework for problem analysis, and it specifies the roles of social media as a digital conflict driver that powers effective polarization through influencing essentially 5 archetypes. Through influencing essentially behavior, that lead to these 5 observable archetypes of polarization. The first one is attitudes, the second, affiliation, the third, interaction, the fourth, interest, and the fifth, norms. And I'll talk a little bit more in detail about these as I give the examples. But in conducting the social media mapping, what participants did is find concrete signals in their data that pointed to each of these archetypes of polarization. And where there are other ways to organize the findings of any social media mapping, we find that this categorization points most directly to how the research findings eventually informed the design of the pilot projects, which I'll speak about a little bit as well. Can I have the next slide? Okay, so the first examples that I want to give come from the research that was conducted by participants from Lebanon, Palestine, and Syria, who actually worked together on one piece of analysis, and they were looking at the data together. And they mostly were looking at discourse around gender. And what they found were signals that pointed to the polarization of attitudes and the polarization of norms. So I just wanted to zoom into what we mean by these, right? So where we talk about attitudes, we're talking about perceptual shifts towards stereotypes, vilification, dehumanization, and de-individuation. Where we're talking about norms, we're speaking about the reinforcement of trust-degrading norms, expected negative interaction outcomes, security dilemmas, harsher tactics on social media. And some of the signals are on there. So you can see how these two are likely to co-occur. And so it was a bit difficult to distinguish whether we were talking about attitude or norm polarization. Can I have the next slide? Okay, so participants from Syria found evidence of polarizing attitudes on social media posts discussing the roles of women that women can play in society, where there's clear evidence of a perceptual shift towards stereotypes. This was clear not just in the qualitative analysis of posts that they conducted, but also in observing the topic network graph, which is what you're seeing, which shows that the issue of the role of women is largely addressed in terms of masculinity and gender identity. When they then dug into these posts, what they saw was that conversations revolved around the appropriate jobs for women based on physical condition or customs and traditions. On the other hand, the role of women is not discussed in relation to human rights or even less economic issues, including material needs. It was interesting to us that looking at the same data, participants in Lebanon and Palestine observed a polarization of attitudes towards women that has resulted in the perpetuation of polarized norms in the network public sphere. Men have a greater tendency to stereotype women, as was clear in the qualitative analysis that they did on the comments on Facebook in particular, that suggests emotions are a sign of weakness in women, and also sentiment analysis that showed negative reaction towards posts indicating that women have financial and economic independence. So quite similar in that sense in the relation to financial and economic financial and educational independence. Some of that analysis was actually conducted by looking at word clouds, which showed a pattern where the word woman was always joined to a male figure. And it was evident from the word clouds and the qualitative analysis that men are commenting on topics predominantly about women, whereas women tend to be sidelined when it comes to topics that are predominantly about men. So in general, participants observed that men either react negatively to content about women or approach it with ridicule. And I think what was interesting is that the analysis results on polarized attitudes and norms around gender informed the content strategies of the three teams, of three of the teams in these different countries. So for example, participants in Syria are running a campaign to challenge stereotypes about women in scientific positions. Participants in Lebanon have designed an approach that uses humor and gender conscious content to mainstream gender equality and break gender stereotypes. So a very direct translation into the interventions. Can I have the next slide? Okay, the next example that I want to talk about is actually something that conducting separate analysis, both participants working in Kurdistan and participants working in Jordan saw in their analysis, which is polarization around a combination of attitudes and interests. So I talked already about what we mean by attitudes. By interest, what we mean is where there are clear signals on social media that there's a pursuit of group power and interest. So this can come out as zero-sum thinking. It can come out as the transformation of issues from specific to general. We see that quite a lot. This is where we see a lot of the content that is misinformation and disinformation feeds into this archetype in our view. Can I have the next slide? Yeah. So I said, two different contexts, but interestingly, both saw that attitudes and interests were polarized around religion. In the case of Kurdistan, a qualitative analysis of the language used on Facebook posts revealed a toxic and polarizing atmosphere against religious minorities, especially Yazidis and Christians, fueled largely by misinformation and dehumanization. This was actually contrary to their initial hypotheses, where they thought that hateful narratives would actually center around ethnic identity, not religious identity. But what they found was that posts that were related to religious ceremonies drew the most discriminatory comments and mockery against religious symbols. They also found in addition to the discriminatory comments, they found Islamic verses and sayings of the Prophet Muhammad that were posted in the comments section. And where evidently these verses are not inherently problematic, they were being instrumentalized to support hateful narratives. Another thing that was quite interesting about what they found is that one of the unifying characteristics of the comments that were made was the use of the plural we or you, which is something that we also identify in general as a signal of this kind of polarization, as a reference to kind of the superiority of one group over another. As a result of the insights that they found here, the participants in Kurdistan are changing the strategy of addressing comments on their own page by creating a dedicated group of moderators who will intervene in comment threads where misinformation and dehumanizing narratives towards religious minorities is shared. So they've shifted their strategy as a result of this finding. Now, I said in Jordan, of course, different context, but something similar came out in terms of this polarization of attitudes and interests around religion. Jordanian participants found that the language used across Facebook and Twitter showed signs of the use of morality and moral authority to polarize interests. Participants observed that social media users use words that show moral anger, such as shame, taboo, and are more likely to respond to emotional words about religion. So when they were doing word searches using some of these keywords, they were really finding these reactions to be quite evident. They also noted the influence of religious influences on people's opinions and their reactions to certain posts. And finally, they noted that many mainstream media pages often publish questions about other religions or share videos of people speaking against other religions. And where these posts are disguised as open exchanges, they attribute moral authority to one position and tend to attract comments only from those who agree, often leading to hateful or violent comments. Again, identifying this tactic to fuel polarization informed the content strategy of the interventions of two of the teams in Jordan. One team is intervening to raise awareness of the importance of creating safe comments on Facebook, especially those related to the posts of media actors and religious actors that drive polarization. And another team noticed that commenters on social media invoke freedom of opinion and expression to justify hate speech. And so they're running a content strategy addressing this particular issue. Can I have the next slide? The next example I want to give you is about a team that found a clear example of just norm polarization, and this is something that participants in Yemen looked at in particular. So again, I spoke about norms before. Oh, okay, yeah, maybe I already spoke about it. So so Julie was like, you already said this. So norms in Yemen, basically, there was a really clear example of norms that are polarized based on group identity. What was most evident was the prevalence of coordinated harassment and back attacks on social media. In the Yemeni retweet network, which is what you're looking at right now, there are 3 clear poles representing the 3 conflicting political parties. These relatively homogeneous sub-networks present discourse directed exclusively to the same group, with repeated patterns of content sharing by the same group, including lots of negative comments and hate speech on accounts, especially on posts that talk about the group. The rate of adoption of hate speech on Twitter is particularly high. Most of the actors in this network, surprisingly, because this is not always the case, are individuals or influencers and not external platforms or institutions. And in identifying the pervasiveness of hate speech on Twitter in particular, the participant teams from Yemen decided to focus on this. So all 3 teams that are working in Yemen are really focusing on narrative change around hate speech, essentially. One of them is running one that is very focused on peaceful coexistence between North and South before the conflict started. Another team is running a campaign that is more about raising awareness on the impact of hate speech on society at large. Whilst the 3rd team is focusing on people's experience of hate speech. But they've all really coalesced around this particular signal of norm polarization. Can I have the next slide? Okay, and the last example I want to give is about affiliation and interaction polarization, which I haven't spoken about yet. And I just want to pause a moment on this diagram, because one thing that's quite interesting to us is that both in Libya and in Tunisia, so 2 very different contexts, when participants looked at the social media map, particularly at the network maps, the networks of social media accounts, they both saw evidence of the difference in between polarized affiliation and polarized interaction. And because this is something that people don't often fully grasp, I think it's quite an interesting example. So polarized affiliation is really where there's an aggregation of actors, homogeneity, self-censorship, echo chambers. That's what we're talking about. Polarized interaction is where a network is very segregated and there's limited bridging. Both of those are really, both of those deserve to be addressed, but they're slightly different and require slightly different tactics. So I think that's why it's quite interesting. So in Libya, the social media map focused on conversations about gender. In Tunisia, it focused on understanding the differences between how the older and the younger generation interact with topics on social media. I'm not going to actually give both examples. I just wanted to tell you that happened in 2 of the contexts, and I'm going to show you the example from Tunisia in particular. Can I have it? Yeah. I just want to check. Yes, okay, Habib is in the room. So Habib Saya, who's actually one of the, who's in the audience in the webinar, is actually the person who made these diagrams. So I just wanted to call out and thank Habib for making these really easy to understand network diagrams. What you're looking at right now is the Facebook commenter network for monitored accounts in Tunisia, which shows really clear signs of network segregation. With some bridging, which is a possible space for intervention. There's a clear boundary between a youth cluster with content mostly from alternative media and activist accounts, and a cluster dominated by the older generation, with most content coming from mainstream media and partisan political actors. So you can see that it's signaled on the diagram, the youth cluster and the politics or older generation cluster. The most influential account in the youth cluster is Lisena, a page which represents the voice of high school students and is engaged in a struggle against the education establishment, which is dominated by older people. The space of possible conversion is centered around an account called Foot24, which is actually a football news site, basically, with commenters on this content potentially bridging between the two poles. Can I have the next slide? So that's what's happening on Facebook, right? So on Facebook, what we're seeing is, excuse me, what we're seeing is mostly a signal of polarized interactions. But interestingly, on YouTube, for the same topic, what we're seeing is mostly a network that is showing polarized affiliation. Why do we say this? Because when we look at this network, this is the YouTube commenter network, so the network of people commenting on YouTube videos. What we see is an aggregation of homogeneous actors into distinct clusters, which suggests that this network is likely to be dominated by polarized affiliation. So on one end of the graph, there is a youth subcultures cluster, which is mostly about entertainment. On the other end of the graph, there are two political clusters that tend to attract middle-aged people whose content is highly polarizing and often spreads disinformation. And between them, there's this large cluster around vox pop content, which suggests that there may be a strong appetite for content which features the voices and perspectives of ordinary people. So again, the analysis of these results, particularly the results on polarized affiliation in Tunisia, led participants to design an intervention that centers the voices of young and old people, sharing their perspectives in a video to start a conversation, which in some ways is attempting to approach this vox pop style that appears to act as a bridge between the youth and the older generation. Can I have the next slide? So that was basically a whirlwind tour of some of the types of findings that the partners have come up with through the digital maps process. This was always meant to be a pilot of this process. It's been a really intensive 6 months. I mean, if you think about the fact that the 18 organizations that have engaged in this analysis came on board onto the program in October. They very quickly defined their problem statements, decided what data to collect. By mid-February, they had conducted all the analysis, and they're now designing and implementing interventions. So it's been quite a fast process in a way of kind of learning what is possible to do with participatory action research on social media mapping. We're not at the end. We haven't conducted a full evaluation of this program. So these are just some emerging challenges and maybe some opportunities and some lessons, actually one opportunity and one lesson. The two main challenges I think that we've found as we went through this is that when people say, let's conduct social media mapping, we always have this moment, right, when we're starting to work with partners who want to do that, where we're just like, what do you actually mean? Like, what is your question? What is it you're actually looking at and looking for in the data? And the bottom line is that we can only look at a subspace of social media. So when we're talking about the network public sphere, all of the conversations that are out there, in order to really get to a sensible amount of data that we can look at, we need to cut it down to a subspace. So when I was showing you these findings, these are only findings that pertain to this particular subset of accounts talking about this topic in this country. They're not applicable beyond that. That means that they're very relevant to that subspace, but that the findings that we have cannot be extrapolated to other areas. The second challenge is that this is quite resource intensive. It takes people hours. And it takes data power, and it takes server space, and all of these things, cost time and cost money. And I think that's something that sometimes there's a perception that social media mapping is something that can be done quickly and easily. And our view is that to get to this kind of depth of analysis, you actually do need to invest some resources. And so I think that points to both the opportunity and the lesson that comes out of this. I'm actually going to start with the lesson, which is that I think this type of participatory action research on social media is worthwhile only for a subset of actors who are engaged in digital interventions in a sustained way. So who plan to continue to try to influence conversations on social media, polarization on social media, to try to shift the network public sphere. People who just want to have a snapshot of what is happening, maybe this kind of process is too intensive to engage with. So I think that's maybe the main lesson. I think that the flip side of that is that there is a real opportunity, which is that we've seen in this work that participatory action research can be translated into concrete intervention design for interventions that try to change the network public sphere. That connection is possible in between research and practice. And that, I think, opens up a lot of opportunities for people who are interested in dedicating their time to this kind of work. And with that, I think I'm going to stop, because the idea was to get as many questions and comments from people as possible. So yeah.
I'll also stop screen sharing, but if your question references back one of the slides, then I'll turn that back on. We have some questions already, so maybe we can get started with Lisa Shirk's question first about the conceptual framework of the archetypes of polarization. Lisa, you and I should talk more about this when I see you coming up next. It is pending publication. It will be in a book chapter by the World Bank. In a forthcoming chapter there. It is original. We've come up with it, though the archetypes themselves are really an amalgamation of a lot of formerly done research and theory on polarization, specifically from like social psychology fields primarily. And then our contribution to that has really been doing that outer circle, which is looking at what are today's signals of polarization on social media. So happy to share more about that. We have another question from Ted Perlmutter, who's at Columbia University teaching on human rights and social media. And he asked, maybe Elena, if you want to take this, what distinguished between groups that succeeded and those that did not?
Can we both take this?
Yeah, sure.
Partly also because my voice is starting to fail me.
Yeah.
I don't know that we know yet who has succeeded and who has failed is the real answer, because the pilot interventions are ongoing, Ted. So we don't have an evaluation of the pilots. What I can say is that it's been really clear to us that it's been easier for some partners to take on the research findings and integrate them into the work that they want to do, and that I don't know, is there a defining characteristic as to why? I think some exposure to social media analytics definitely helped. Like the partners who were already doing social media analytics on their own social media got the point of this much quicker. But there have been some who really knew nothing about this and have come all the way and used the research findings to design their interventions. What do you think, Julie?
Yeah, I was going to say too, the project is really split naturally into 3 phases, if you will. One, which was this like intensive research, data coding, another, which was analysis of that, and the third, which they are now at intervention. And I would say instead of kind of who succeeded and failed, it's like who had a better fit in each of those phases, maybe. And some people, like Elena mentioned, already were doing analytics, were somewhat comfortable with that sort of data analysis, really thrived in that area. Others weren't so much interested in that, but make really solid interventions and have a long history of doing that, and so are thriving in this area. And so I guess everyone got a taste of all of those areas, and some, I think, will say in the future they probably don't want to go that deep into data. Again, they want to continue doing what they're doing, and others will say, we probably don't want to design intervention in this way. We want to stick here. So I think there's different levels of resonance across the phases. We've got another question from Michael here, which Michael, maybe you can just unmute too if you want to. He said, I think it might be useful to elaborate a little more how not only the research findings informed the concepts and interventions, but how this enables evaluation to demonstrate impact on the sub-corners of the network public sphere. And Elena, you're kind of working on evaluation now. Do you want to elaborate on that a little bit more?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if we're set up in a way where Michael can just speak out his comment, because he followed it up afterwards by saying that, yeah, participatory action research can be continuous. Okay, there we go. So we've invited
two of you.
twice.
There's two of you, so I just did both, Michael.
All right.
Two Michaels. Do you want to just make your points directly?
Yeah, because I think I mean, we've talked about this, but I think it's interesting and maybe of interest to the audience. There's a kind of, there's those general findings that you get. Well, they're quite specific, but they can inform an intervention. But obviously the research and the analytics have been applied to a specific sub corner, as you mentioned, particular accounts, etc. And so in some cases, the pilots are more or less then embedded back in that specific network. So I think in certain cases, the evaluation can really then look at how are the changes within the dashboard again. And that just linked on to my second point, which is, in that sense, the kind of participatory action research can be circular. You look at a system, you kind of prod the system, if you like, based on assumptions about the concept, then you can re-look at the system and you can kind of go again.
Right, and I just want to say, so two comments on that. I couldn't agree more. And in fact, so we're doing an evaluation of each one of the pilot interventions. And what these evaluation frameworks are set up to do is basically look at what were the research assumptions that led to the design of this intervention, and then try to see whether we can spot any change after the intervention happens. Obviously, we haven't done those yet, so we don't have the outcomes of it. But I was just pulling up an example, and so I just wanted to bring up because I talked about Tunisia. So, for example, in the case of Tunisia, no, I'll need a minute to find it. I'll find an example in a moment where it's very clear how we're using the platform to see those changes. But we are doing that in a number of cases. And the other thing I wanted to say is that I think this point, Michael, about the participatory action research being continuous, is also related to this thing that I was saying about the lesson learned about where is this most useful. So investing in this kind of research is most useful where you're going to have that kind of continuous cycle, right? So where you're not just trying to get a snapshot and then design a program and go away and never look at this data again, but where your intervention is back in the network public sphere and you just want to continue looking at how you can impact it. And that's where it's really worth investing in this kind of research, right?
That's great. Thank you both. All right, let's continue moving down the questions. We might call you Michael back in, or Habib as well. Mark was asking, I think you mentioned Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube only. So why these channels when Instagram and TikTok are increasingly popular?
I mean, I think the quick answer is because none of the partners asked for Instagram or TikTok.
Yeah.
They still thought that the most relevant conversations were happening on Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. So it was a choice of the 18 organizations. We're not averse to including Instagram and TikTok, and I think it could be really interesting. I actually don't know so much about the TikTok API and what would be possible, but I know Instagram we would very easily be able to integrate, but that's not what the organizations thought was most relevant at the moment.
Yeah. Okay, Jane asked a question about hearing more about the types of interventions that are being implemented. I'm going to bookmark that for a second, Jane, because one thing we are doing is sending after this paper to everyone here, which has, listed there in the paper examples. So you could see that there. Though if we have time, maybe we can get Habib to talk about Tunisia. Bernie Ward asks, to what extent do you think or know that what is observed and analyzed online is a reflection of the attitudes, norms, affiliation, interests, etc., of the wider population who do not, for example, use Twitter? Has this comparison been made? And hence, can this analysis also guide programming that is not only about social media?
Do you want to have a go at that? Or do
Yeah,
you
you're
want
like,
me
to? I can have a first go. I think number one is just, it's important to make that explicit, that is the case, that it is a limited number of people that are on these channels. Those who are using the channels are, again, further limiting that. And so one thing that we were doing in that sort of analysis process and intervention design was inviting to partners to think about that, to look not only at what they were seeing, but what they were not seeing. But then I'd say another piece of that is that because partners were designing interventions for the network public space, they were designing it for this conversation that was happening on social media. That wasn't necessarily a problem if it didn't reflect exactly, because that was the audience that they were trying to engage with, were those who were engaging on social media. So I don't think that you can make a direct line to say we can design an offline intervention exactly on this. But because it is part of the discourse and the conversation, I think it would still be relevant. And one thing that we sort of stress and partners found as well is the importance of kind of hybrid online offline approaches, that intervening online is affecting offline relationships, and intervening offline, talking specifically about the online, is affecting online as well. Would you add anything to that, Elena?
Cool. No, I think that was spot on.
Okay, great. Galang is asking, could you further explore how the researchers use the insight to design the intervention? Oh, my thing just went down. And building up questions from others, it would be great to also hear what interventions are being implemented. I wonder, Habib, if I could put you on the spot. Talk about Tunisia. Oh yeah, go ahead.
We haven't discussed this, but I wonder whether actually, because the interventions are ongoing and none of the partners are here, whether, we kind of generally talked about what some of those interventions are, and there is a virtual exchange where they will be presenting what they've done. But we know some of them have some security concerns, and I just feel like it's an ongoing thing. So maybe we could invite Habib to talk about Tunisia, but I don't think talking about all of the interventions is such a great idea right this second, if that's okay.
Yeah, that's a good, thank you for doing the break. Okay. Yeah, we need to, that was great. Thank you. Okay, I do want to answer Mark's next question. We are very interested in opportunities to create spaces for engagement between young people and leaders institutions. Do any channels or any particular content formats lend themselves to such intergenerational engagement? Maybe this again just speaks to the Tunisia case, which is interesting. So I think Mark, the answer might be, it really depends on your context. And that can be when you were, if you were designing a process like this and doing analysis, that could be one of the questions. And therefore the types of audiences that you would include in your subsphere would be towards looking at that question. So what are the common types of content? What are both older and younger people sharing or consuming, et cetera? And that's something that Tunisia is doing, and then base that intervention based on the type of format or spaces that they found both older generations and younger generations were using. Is that right? Yeah. Okay, great. Ted is noting that there was an earlier study about Tunisia right after the Arab Spring, which showed very little polarization, but that was because there was a very small part of the liberal tech elite on Twitter where nasty polarization was elsewhere. I wonder if you'd want to just go off of this, Elena, and share a little bit about what Jordan found and why they engage with the topic of self-censorship, because I think it's related to this, where maybe online it didn't look like there was much polarization.
Oh, interesting. I wasn't thinking of that connection. And also, I just want to say I wanted to shut down some of the other partner sharing, but not the Tunisia one. So maybe Habib, if you can get ready to, we're going to call you in to talk a little bit about the Tunisia research findings and how they translated into an intervention. But I'll take this question first, which gives you a few seconds to think about your answer. So Ted, I think what Julie's referring to is that in the case of Jordan, the participants were looking at how religion and tradition are discussed on social media, and they also didn't find a lot of evident polarization. They did on some issues, sub-issues. But one of the things that they all identified is that there seemed to be very clear signs of people self-censoring. And some of that came across as using particular emojis to not say things, or the complete absence of certain content, or the fact that certain people really didn't seem to be posting as much as they were expecting. And so one of the partners is doing something that is trying to almost emerge some of the things that are not being discussed on social media. So they're doing a campaign on self-censorship on social media and why that happens, particularly amongst artists. So I think, I think that your general point about who is on social media and what are they really talking about and what does this tell us and what does it not tell us is an important thing to keep in mind, and it connects to what Julie was saying before in response to how much of this can be used for offline interventions. I think social media discourse is important in the way that it informs the public discourse in general, but it's not the public discourse, and we all know that, right? So the Jordan example is another way that we can see that what we're seeing on social media is what we're not seeing, and that in itself is interesting as well.
Mm. All right, Habib, can you share more about the Tunisia example?
Yes. Hello. So first, to respond to Ted, the study you referenced influenced a lot the initial design of the program, and I think in Tunisia's case we didn't see polarization on Twitter. Yes, as you said, because the Tunisian community was very small, so and not very diverse, but polarization on Facebook, which is the primary social media in Tunisia, is quite strong along different types of divides with our local partner, which is a youth-led alternative media. We focused specifically on generational divides, and the objective of the pilot, which was devised after the research, was to increase positive interactions and mutual understanding between older and younger generations, and this is done through a set of different products and modes of engagement. We're leveraging the assets and the community of this local partner, which is active. Their media platform is present on different platforms, mainly YouTube, but also they have a large following on Facebook, Instagram. And what's also interesting is that they have a Discord server where core members of their community interact a lot through live audio talks. And so again, to go back to the topic, the research has shown that some topics are particularly seem to be particularly polarizing. The way they are talked about by young people and older people is quite different in terms of emotionality and sentiment. And we also looked at the local partner zone audience, which is young. What are the topics they would like to discuss with their parents, but they're unable to because they're not comfortable or they're afraid of their parents' reaction. And the idea is to work with a psychologist to develop to produce a video which conveys young people's perspectives and perhaps grievances in ways that are non-violent, but also most importantly, ways that resonate with their parents' frames of reference. And the idea is for Bubli's audience to share that video online with the older generations, but also offline, and hold offline conversations around this content. Use it as a gateway for engaging in a meaningful conversation with their parents about these topics. And following that, the young people will be called to engage in a live conversation on Boobly with and report, about the outcomes of those offline conversations with parents. We are also inviting an influencer who's capable of bridging between the two generations, who's quite popular with both generations, and who will be participating in that live conversation, and then who will be able to retarget that content and those messages to his own audience, and specifically the older segment of that audience. So yeah.
Thank you, Habib. Thanks. So you got a picture of just the process and how that was going to that, and then what the intervention will look like. And you could get a full picture as well if you wanted to in the virtual exchange coming up. I don't see any more questions in the chat, but as we've been having this reflection and reading some of the comments coming through, I think it's, maybe worthy to note that I think this is kind of this new and unprecedented time where we have these global contexts at various levels of conflict, now all sharing these new mediums in common space where conflict is happening is social media platforms. Which just adds like new questions and dimensions into the question about localization and hybridity and peace building, and shows that like a lot of our strategies at the end of the day are now shared. We have a sort of menu of options for intervening in this shared space, whether it's in Tunisia or Jordan or the US. Oh, and I've got a little person coming in.
Sorry, and obviously the offline world intervenes as she's talking about the online space. Ted, I can see you've got a question, so I'm going to go ahead and go with that. Have we thought about taking the work once completed to the platforms or their local content moderation? So this is really interesting, Ted, because actually one of the premises of the Digital Maps program was that we were not going to focus on content moderation specifically, but more on intervening in a more conversation-like or dialogue-like fashion or with new content. So that it wasn't about taking things down, but rather about engaging with what's there. And that's somewhat of a shift actually for a number of the partners. Some of the partners that we've worked with, certainly one of them, are already in touch with the social media platforms about content moderation in their countries. So no, we don't currently have a plan to take this to the social media platforms or to their content moderation folk, because I don't think it's so much about content moderation as it is about engaging with what's there. But I don't know if others have different thoughts on that. We certainly haven't talked about it yet. Michael, I don't know what you think about that point, if you have a different opinion on it.
No, I mean, we share that opinion, and I think, when we designed the program, we wanted to situate, specifically in the space. So I think two things that we wanted to do that we thought was somewhat different. One was around the diversity of actors, so the partnership across those range of actors, data scientists, and NGO like Build Up, university sector, but also the arts and sort of creative cultural sectors. And that obviously ties to both, British Council as a cultural relations organisation, but also the role of that type of content in a way in potentially disrupting the immediacy of social media, the spectacle that you described at the start, and how actually content like that can allow people to slow down and step back and kind of, potentially bridge those divides in new ways. So that was, yeah.
Yeah, so where I think some of this work might be kind of interesting to some of the policy folks at Facebook or Twitter or YouTube, I don't think it will be actionable in the sense that it doesn't provide recommendations about how to moderate content, because that's not really what we were looking at so much.
I also have a hunch that some of that stuff further polarizes. I mean, I've no evidence to back that up, but I think it's an interesting question. I think people feel like they're in an information war. I remember one comment.
You mean content moderation further?
Polarizes. Content moderation,
right.
and certainly I remember one partner talked about, when they were talking about what they might do, they talked about debunking. And we kind of raised the question, like, how would you feel if someone said they were going to debunk you? You know, whether or not you agree with the views of what they're expressing. So again, I think this is the kind of dialogue point you made, and the kind of cultural relations, and an effort to, you know, we're doing another program about deep listening that colleagues from the British Council will be aware of. But, you know, it's that kind of space, you know, how do we actually listen to each other, build bridges, understand each other? Yeah.
And I think this is really where, you know, where we felt when the British Council put out this call for this kind of work, that it was a really good fit to digital peace building approaches as well, right? Because we've been saying for a while that if we really just focus on content moderation, then and moderating content that is hateful or incites to violence, then we're ignoring all of the digital conflict drivers underneath, which are where effective polarization is really cooked, basically. And so that's more what we're trying to deal with some of these interventions, and also what the analysis focuses on. I know we're at time, Julie, so I'm going to hand back to you.
Perfect, thanks. Now is just the time to do another plug, is that if you want to hear more about the interventions, which partners are doing now and how they turned out and what people learned and what they're coming away with, that we are doing this virtual learning exchange event that Elena mentioned. Most of it is closed, but there will be opportunities to hear from panels of partners who have been doing the work. So if you are interested in joining that, you can please email me. Oh, perfect. Great. Elena put it in the chat already. And in addition to that, I will be emailing you a follow-up of this, which will include the recording of this webinar and also this position paper that we put out that sort of details what we talked about here and provides some more insight into the types of interventions that people are exploring. And lastly, just thank you for joining, and thank you for engaging and being interested in this topic and this work. And we appreciate the conversation and discussion about it. So thank you all, and we hope to hear from you and or see you again soon. Bye, everyone.